All right, we're in the story of Esther once again, and what we've done so far is we've talked about the hiddenness of God. We've talked about the toxicity of pride in the story of Haman in particular. And now we're looking at the book as a whole, and we're going to be talking today about how Esther challenges us to think about the tension between human choices and decisions and God's sovereignty and control. You know, I've mentioned this before, I'm sure, that and many people have mentioned this, that the name God or the Lord or some designation of God is totally absent from the book of Esther. On the one hand, the story of Esther sounds like a story about people making their own free choices that lead to the consequences that it's going to lead to, and the rest is history. And yet at the same time, the reason Esther is in the Bible, really, is because you look at the actual events that take place and you say, only the hand of God could have accomplished what was accomplished in this story. Only God's sovereign control could have led these events to take place when and how they took place and to lead to the result that they led to. And so we're looking at this story, and we're kind of left in this tension. And really, I'd like to tell you, or I'd like to give you two conclusions, but I'm going to give them to you at the conclusion. So we'll get there in a second. Just know there's kind of 2 points that we're going to be making this morning. I want you to think about the story of Esther from the lens of human choices for a moment. By the way, on not this past Wednesday, but the Wednesday before, we read through the whole book of Esther together, and we've looked at different verses and passages. So I'm going to assume that most of us are somewhat familiar with this story. I'm not going to give you a reference for every single thing, although I certainly can. And if you're saying, hey, where was that one part afterwards, just ask me. I'll be happy to point it out. But just as you're looking at the story of Esther, think about the story of human choices. Now, I didn't bring it with me, but I had printed out the book of Esther, like 12 pages, and I had gone through with my pen or marker or whatever, and I had just circled different places that were human choices, where you could say, okay, somebody made a decision here, and whatever the consequences were, somebody made a decision about this particular thing. And I did not count them, but I can tell you it's on every single page many times. I mean, you can just circle, okay, that's a choice, that's a choice, that's a choice, that's a choice. Now, I did the same thing from the other side of looking at God's control and looking at God's plan. But for now, if you think about human choices, you think about, just as a sampling, think about the fact that Vashti in chapter 1 made a very significant choice. Vashti she chose to refuse the king's command to present herself possibly nude before all of these people and all of that, and she says, I'm not going to do that. Now, don't think about all the implications, and that's how Esther gets into the story and all of that. Okay, that's true, but from her perspective, she just made one choice, just one choice. You think about the story from the lens of Mordecai. Mordecai made a choice. Mordecai was at the gate of the king's court, and here comes Haman walking by, and there's been a command that's been written that said everybody's got to bow down before Haman, and Mordecai made a choice to not bow down. And yes, there's consequences that ripple out from that. Haman's going to, all that. But from Mordecai's perspective, he just made a choice. Mordecai also, sitting at the gate, heard about a plot to kill the king, and Mordecai made a choice to report what was said to Esther, and that led to the plot being uncovered, and the king didn't die. He just made a choice. What about Haman? Haman made a lot of choices, a lot of bad choices in the story. Haman chose when Mordecai refused to bow down to him, even though he had everything he could ever want from the worldly perspective, except this one guy didn't respect him. Haman chose to fixate on that, to plot not just his destruction, but the annihilation of the entire Jewish people because of that. He made a choice. He made a choice to build a gallows at a house, basically, in order that he could put Mordecai to death. Yes, we know that story's going to work out where Haman's going to die there. But Haman just made a choice. He just said, I'm going to build this thing, and I'm going to get my revenge. We think about the story of Esther from the lens of Esther's choices. Esther, in Esther chapter 4, makes the most famous choice in the story of Esther, and perhaps the most significant one. She gets the report from Mordecai that Haman has conspired to set a date, send out a message to all the provinces that the people of Israel were going to be eradicated on a particular day, a particular month. She gets that report from Mordecai, and Mordecai's word comes to her and says, don't think that if you keep silent, you're going to be spared, that you can save yourself from this. Deliverance is going to come for Israel from somewhere else, but you and your family's house, your father's house, are going to perish if you keep silent. And Esther, she's faced with a choice. And in Esther 4, verse 16, she says, she makes several choices here, right? But leading to the final choice. She says, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa. Hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. There's some choices there, right? She responds to this threatening the scene, not by being driven to despair, not by trying to get the best advice of the day. No, she goes and she says, we got to fast and pray before God. She says, then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And here's her choice. If I perish, I perish. Different ways of looking at that last phrase there. But some people will even translate that as, instead of if, you could translate it as when. When I perish, I perish. In other words, she's made a choice that she's probably going to die. But it'll be worth it if she has a chance to save her people. If I perish, I perish. When I perish, I perish. I made my choice. She made a choice. The Bible is filled with discussions about people making choices. If you think about in Joshua, when Joshua is talking to the people as they're going into the promised land, and Joshua is at the end of his life, and he's looking back at all they've accomplished, and he says to them, much like Moses in the end of Deuteronomy, he says to them, you choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. That sounds like a real choice he's offering them. A meaningful choice. He says, you choose who you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It sounds like he's making two choices there. He's offering a choice, and he's making his own choice. Moses, when Moses was nearing the end of his life in Deuteronomy, kind of Moses' big final sermon to Israel, Deuteronomy, he says to them, behold, I am setting before you the choice between life and death. Choose life and live. It sounds like a choice. In the book of Proverbs, there's a lot of these type proverbs, and I put many of them in the bulletin. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. What does that mean? He says, the person that makes choices, the person that plans and is diligent and looking forward, he says, surely those plans will lead to abundance, but if you're hasty, if you're not thinking things through, and you're just rushing to do this, that, or the other, you're going to come to poverty. That's what Solomon wants to tell his son in the way that Proverbs is written. He says, don't be hasty, be diligent, make plans, and pursue them. Choices, decisions. The Bible then insists to us that human beings are capable of making real choices, meaningful choices that impact their lives. But how we would miss the story of Esther if we preach the story of Esther as a series of human choices. I mean, we would rob Esther of the whole story being told to us. Because you can also look at the story of Esther and you can see a story of God's hand working, his providence, his sovereign control. People describe it different ways, but you can see God working behind the scenes at every turn in the story, even when people are making choices. I mean, we could talk about basically every chapter, and I could, say, okay, this happens because of this and because of this. But if we just use the ones that I've mentioned already, if you think about Vashti's decision, Vashti made a choice not to come before the king. She had no way of knowing that that was going to be the catalyst that ended up, through a series of events, leading Esther to become queen of Persia, perfectly positioned to be able to make her appeal before the king and save Israel. She had no idea. She just made a choice. But there was God working his plan, working his will, working his purpose, and ultimately accomplishing it. Mordecai's refusal to bow down before Haman, that's a choice that he made. But Mordecai sitting there at the gate, not bowing down, happens to be at the right place at the courtyard, at the right time at the courtyard, to hear two people, the right people, talking amongst one another about a plot to kill the king. He happens to catch the details at the right time, and he happens to say, okay, I have a contact that's on the inside, Esther, I can share this with, and I can save the king's life. Boy, that's a lot of happens. It just so happened that he was there at the right time, the right place, heard the right thing, had the right contact. A lot of happens. A lot of happenstance. Oh, and when he saves the king's life, it just so happens that people record it in a particular book. Mordecai the Jew helped save King Xerxes on such and such day from the plot of these two servants of the king, and so forth and so on. They just happened to write it down. And that book just happened to get put somewhere on the king's bookshelf. And it just so happened that Haman decides he's going to try to end Mordecai's life, built the gallows and everything. It just so happens that on the day that Haman decides, now I'm going to get my revenge, he just so happens to be walking into the king's courtyard, unknowing that the king happened, in chapter 6, verse 1, not to be able to sleep that night. And the king happened to, not wanting to sleep, happened to think to himself, maybe I could do some reading. Maybe that'll help me sleep. And it just so happened that whatever servant it was that the king sent to get him a book, it just so happened that that servant went and got that book. And it just so happened that as Xerxes was sitting there at 3 a.m. reading, it just so happened that he got to the chapter that had the details about Mordecai the Jew delivering him. And it just so happened that at just the right time that morning, when the servants come back into the room, Xerxes says, "What has been done for this man?" They say, "Nothing." And he says, "Who's in the courtyard?" Well, it just so happens that here's Haman walking into the courtyard, and he says, well, bring him in. And we talked about this last week, that the king says, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman thinks to himself, oh, it's certainly me that's being talked about. Haman's walking in the court at just this right time. That's a lot of happenstance, isn't it? Look, if you would, at Esther chapter 3, because this is where our point really is made the clearest. Esther 3, verses 5 through 15. Esther 3, 5 through 15. I'm not going to read all of this, but I want you to look here at verse 5. Verse 5 says, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai. That's a choice that Haman made. He said, I am going to pursue this end. But here's where it gets so special. In verse 7. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur. That is, they cast lots before Haman day after day. Now, let me just call a timeout and say, why are they casting lots? What is all of that about? Ancient people, including Israel, okay, this is not just the pagans did this, Israel did this too. Joshua cast lots before the Lord. Anyway, what the people did is they had dice and they would not play dice like against each other and gamble or whatever. They would roll dice and use it to determine God's will about something. The God's will, not God of Israel, but the God's will about something. So they would roll their dice and say, okay, Baal wants, or whatever God they're worshiping, Marduk or whatever. So they would roll dice to determine what God's will was, or the God's will was. So here, Haman, he comes and he casts lots to determine what day his gods would approve of this action taking place. It would have been really difficult for the story of Esther to play out the way that it played out if the dice would have been rolled and they would have come up tomorrow. But you know what? The dice came up 11 months from now is the time this year when you're going to be able to do this, Haman, says the dice. He rolls he casts the lots to determine, in a sense, Israel's lot. And it looks, from the perspective of the story, that Haman has made all of these choices, and the kings made choices to go along with it, and all of this. And it looks like, when you're reading the story of Esther, that the lot of Israel is determined by the decisions of evil people in the story. That's what it looks like from their vantage point. It's interesting when you read in the Proverbs, and you read Proverbs 21 verse 5, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. If you are an Israelite listening to the story of Esther read to you each year, you're celebrating the festival, the feast of Purim, which is the annual day of remembrance that Esther decrees at the end of the story that Israel should keep this year by year. If you're sitting there and you're listening to this story and you get here into chapter 3 and Haman casts lots, if you didn't know the Old Testament, you might be thinking, oh, this is a very bleak-looking thing. But if you had read Proverbs 21 verse 5, maybe this is the first little glimpse of hope in the story. Because the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And Haman, he casts his lots here to determine Israel's lot. And yet, the faithful reader of Scripture knows that Haman ultimately doesn't have that kind of power. The power needed to do what he has set out to do. God's plan is not in jeopardy after all. The story of Esther, when the Jews celebrate this feast, remembering, they don't call it Esther's feast. They don't call it the day of deliverance. They don't call it the resistance of the Jews. They don't call it anything like that. They name this holiday Purim, which means lots. Why? Because when Haman cast his lots, God determined Israel's lot. And there was no question in the mind of God as to what would happen in our story. I want to offer you two conclusions from the story of Esther about human choices and God's control, God's sovereignty. The first conclusion I want to offer to you is that the Scriptures teach us that we are responsible people. We're responsible for our choices. Therefore, our present choices and actions really do matter. In other words, you cannot read what the Bible says about the sovereignty of God and say, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, then everything's fixed and determined and all of that. There's just way too many Bible passages for you to have to reconcile that mentality with that say, choose for yourselves. You have to say essentially every single verse that talks about making a choice, making a decision, being faithful, that's all just basically, it's just made up. I mean, it doesn't mean anything because you were always going to do what you were always going to do. Your choices don't really matter. The Scriptures teach us convincingly we are responsible. Haman's responsible for his evil choices. Esther's responsible for her noble choice. Our choices really do matter, but it also teaches us abundantly, clearly, that God is sovereign, and therefore God's people have a certain future. Have a certain future. Your choices matter in the present, absolutely. But again and again, the story of Esther just being one little witness in a long line of witnesses in the Bible, that if you have entrusted your life to Jesus, your future is not determined by the casting of lots. Your future is not determined by the chance of life, where you were born, or where you, who you married, or what job you took, or what illness came your way. Your future ultimately is not determined by the things that happen in your life. You have a certainty, a confidence that comes from following a God who's able to control, in the story of Esther, even the roll of the dice. We have choices to make in our lives. We must make them prayerfully. We must make them diligently, as the Proverbs say. But we must not make them as though God is not able to lead us to His desired future in our lives. Now, think about this. Think about why this is important. If you didn't have a choice, how would you not just be so passive? I mean, nothing matters. So it matters that you have a choice. But if everything was up to you, how would you have any hope for the future? Hadn't you made enough bad decisions in your life to know that if it was all up to you, you wouldn't make it in the end? Hadn't you made enough bad decisions in your life? I've said this before. I don't even know who said this the first time. You're the mastermind of every one of your deepest regrets. That line just sticks with me. You've been the mastermind of your life, right? And you know where that leads. And if God had no control over the future, if God could provide us no certainty as we trust in Jesus, then our life would be dependent upon, I better make this. Listen, the choices people make in Esther, they're small choices at times that lead to huge changes in the story. Every choice that you make would be terrifying if you couldn't rely on the fact that God will see you through to the future that He has secured for you in Jesus Christ. Every choice would be one step away from falling off the cliff. And you look here at what Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1. What Paul says to Timothy is, I know whom I have believed in, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed to him until the end, till that day, against that day. What's Paul saying? He says, I have committed. I've made a choice. I've decided to follow Jesus. I'm continuing to make that decision every single day. But I'm convinced that He is able to keep, He is able to protect, He is able to guard my soul, that Satan is not going to come around and snatch me away from the hand of God. Now, does the Bible teach that somebody could say, I don't want anything to do with Jesus anymore, I'm going to walk this way? Sure. But a person who is walking in the light, putting their faith in Jesus, they're going to make mistakes, they're going to make bad choices at times. But the story of Esther is a story of hope that God uses even bad choices to accomplish ultimately His ends. That Paul could say in Romans chapter 8, that in all things God works for the good of those that love Him, who are called according to His purpose. That Paul could talk in Ephesians chapter 1, not about God planning the individual, you're going to be saved, you're going to be lost, but that God could determine, predestine His people, the church, for everlasting life. And that the people of God could rest in that confidence, knowing to be in God's kingdom is to have an eternally secure future because of what Jesus has done. The story of Esther is a story about God working when He doesn't even seem to be there. He's not even on the page. And yet you can't read Esther and not see the hand of God on every page. When asked about human freedom and God's sovereignty, The early church had a pretty consistent answer. For instance, Augustine, he says, we choose both. We believe people are responsible to make their choices, and their choices have consequences, and their choices really are theirs. And we also believe that in the end, God has a future for his people, that he will see them through to the other side. And therefore, today as we're gathered together, we can have hope, embracing the fact that we have the ability. God has given you the responsibility of making the choice. Are you going to follow him today? Are you going to follow him with your life? That's a very serious thing to think about and to consider. It's the most important thing you could ever think about. Are you going to follow Jesus with your life? That's a challenge. But at the same time, when you make that choice, when you confess Jesus as Lord, when you're immersed into Christ, as we got to see Miss Lisa do last week, when you make that decision and you got your face fixed on Jesus Christ, you can know, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, I'm going to stumble, I'm going to fall. But God's people have a certain future, eternal life with Jesus Christ. If you're here today and you need to make that choice and you need to receive that confidence, we want to invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.